Hello and welcome to the I3 lecture series hosted by the Masters in Digital Photography here at the School of Visual Arts. I am Julie Graham. I initially knew tonight's speaker in his role as an award-winning New York Times photography editor. Jeffrey Henson Scales has been co-editor of the annual Year in Pictures special section for over 15 years, and I had been pitching him portraits to license for my client, Yusuf Karsh. Many of us in the photography world do more than one thing, and I learned that Jeffrey was an important photographer in his own right and an adjunct professor at New York University Tisch School of the Arts. That's quite a tongue twister. Jeffrey has since spent more than 5 decades as a documentary and commercial photographer. His documentary photographs have been exhibited at museums throughout the United States and Europe and have appeared in numerous photography magazines, books, and anthologies. His work is in the permanent collections of the Museum of Modern Art, the Museum of the City of New York, which I must remind the students is worth the ride uptown, go there. The Museum of Fine Arts Houston, George Eastman House, Minneapolis Institute of Art, the Baltimore Museum of Art, National Gallery of Art in Washington, and others. Jeffrey's the author of 2 books of photographs, of which his most recent book, In a Time of Panthers, The Early Photographs, is a newly discovered archive of photographs he made as a teenager in Oakland of the emergence of the Black Panther Party in the 1960s. I had to stop researching eventually as I tried to keep my intros on one side of A4 paper, but I also have learned that in amongst, Jeffrey has produced record covers for a variety of artists and worked in live music production as a road manager, production director, and equipment manager for performers like Minnie Riperton and Cher. So let's learn even more. Well, welcome for Jeffrey.
Greetings. Thank you all for coming. So we'll just get started. So I started taking pictures very young. My father gave me a Leica when I was 11 years old and every issue of Life magazine. And I would do typical things like go to concerts and take pictures of people. But then when I got serious, I started making a lot of portraits of people and portraits on the street and portraits of my friends. And I was very moved by Richard Avedon's work that was at the Marlborough Gallery in the early 70s. So I got very enamored with the surface of portraiture, the surface texture of people in their clothes and things. I started working with a Hasselblad after a number of years and photographing my friends in my Berkeley neighborhood, and then people that I worked with when I was on tour with bands. This was one of the other roadies when I was on a Dave Mason tour. And just different events. Susan Sontag and her son here. Some dear friends of mine, Fredo and her husband Greg, who was a musician that I toured with a number of times. And photographing portraits on the street in LA. And at the time, using film, I used a lot of very fine-grained film that really rendered the surface of things really crisp and clear, which they don't make much of that anymore. This is a choreographer named Joe Layton. And one of the artists that I was tour manager for was Minnie Riperton. This is her husband, Richard Rudolph. And I toured with them for probably 4 or 5 years. And that was probably the closest relationship I had. This is his daughter, Maya Rudolph. And so we were very, very close at the time. This is Ron Carter, a bass player. And, you know, I would travel between, when I was touring, I didn't really live any place specific because I would stay at my home in Berkeley, or I would be in LA and I lived at the Tropicana Motel, and Tom, he lived down the hall. And so I'd be off and on there for a few years. That was in West Hollywood. So family friend named Robin at our house in Berkeley. Ronnie Blakely was an actor, musician who we became close friends, and I was commissioned to do a portrait of her, and she decided she wanted to go climb over the fence and go into the oil fields off La Brea in LA. she was quite the trooper and a great person to work with. This was Cher in 1978. And then I photographed her again in 1981 when I was on tour with her, which was a nice job because I got to live at Caesar's Palace off and on for a year because we were only at Caesar's Palace or Harrah's Tahoe. So we would do 2 weeks at Caesar's, 2 weeks off, 2 weeks at Harrah's for the entire year. And at Caesar's, I even brought my enlarger and put a darkroom in the bathroom of the hotel. And, just sort of running into different people at different times, And, it was back in the day where you could say, oh, can I take a photo? And people say, sure. There was no means of distribution outside of, a major publication. This was a homeless encampment that popped up outside City Hall in 1984. And it was one of the first big homeless encampments in Los Angeles. And it was sort of the tip of the iceberg out there, I would say. And it was right before I moved to the East Coast. I used to go to a lot of the clubs. This was a punk club called The Mask, which was in a basement underneath a porn theater on Hollywood Boulevard, which was a fascinating place. Downtown LA, I would photograph on the street there. That's an evangelist, which was, always fun. And I used to use flash fill a lot because that also used to really articulate the surface detail of people in portraiture. And I've mostly worked in portraiture. A guy named Tony Powers, which is Tyrone Powers' son. This is a filmmaker named Sam Fuller. It was a self-project. I was photographing different directors in Los Angeles, and that was on top of MGM studios. I was using, big strobes out in daylight. Wim Wenders at Zoetrope Studios when he was working on the movie Hammett, which for him was not a good experience. And I thought this image sort of reflected his frustration of being micromanaged by Francis Coppola. And he eventually sort of walked away from that film. And Ronnie asked me to photograph her again. This was in 1981 when she was living with Wim in Malibu. They had gotten married a couple of years previous. And again, she had an idea, she wanted to have sort of the shipwrecked idea. So we spent a couple of days photographing. We shot in the day and late into the evening. This is Frank Zappa, was an artist that I worked with designing equipment for various band members. This was my next door neighbor when I lived in Silver Lake. And her name was Jennifer, and I remember she used to, it was a little cul-de-sac kind of bungalow situation. And I remember she would be skating outside on the concrete with her steel skates, which was really disturbing when you had a hangover. And one day I had a photo shoot inside the apartment. I had all these lights, and she was knocking on my door, and I got up, and she says, "What are you doing?" And I saw her standing there. I said, "Just hold it there for a minute." I turned on the light and took a photo of her, which I always thought made a great picture. This was a guy named Smutty Smith, who was in a rockabilly band. This was in West Hollywood in a parking lot outside Tower Records. And he was the very popular person to photograph. Robert Mapplethorpe photographed him and a bunch of other people. But this is before he came to the East Coast. And I remember I posted this on Instagram, and I got my favorite comment of all time, which was, "That's the best picture of my dad I've ever seen." Hashtag, he's old now. Charles Bukowski, who I photographed at his home in San Pedro. I sort of started working with a 4x5 camera, which was interesting because I was trying to move up in formats. And I remember we went to his house and he said, well, we can't do any photos till we have some drinks for a while. I said, all right, but first let me set up my lights, set up the shot, and then we drank and had food for a couple hours, and then finally said, okay, let's go make some photos. He was very gracious, and it was a fun evening. This was Santana Block Crip. I had been assigned to do a documentary piece on teen gangs in Compton. And it had been a particularly violent year for killings in Compton. And I had a fixer that was a part of a former gang member that was working with Youth Gang Authority. And we would drive around till we would find a gang, which is like a little terrifying thing to do. And we finally, turned a corner and there was a whole group of these guys. And he says, yeah, that's them. And we took a lot of pictures. We're giving them Polaroids and they were really having a nice time. And then I came back like a week later and gave them prints, and they really liked having their picture taken. It was quite an exhilarating experience, partially out of fear and just looking for something to make a photograph of. But that was the Santana Block Crips. I had to do some photos in a recording studio, so I'd rented a Hasselblad super wide camera. And I was carrying it around. This was at the Tropicana Motel where I was living. And this was a guy named Chucky Weiss, who is the subject of a song that was a hit, Chucky's in Love. And he lived in this tiny, tiny room. And I looked in there, I said, wow, okay. So I came back and did a photograph of him. And that inspired me to do a whole nother series. Like, at this point, I started working in series of different sort of groups of people, putting different collections of people or, series of pictures of like a particular place or something. So I got very interested in people's interiors, where they lived and how they lived. So I started photographing musicians in LA, and I started shooting them on 4x5. And it was kind of a big production because there was a lot of lights and a lot of gear. But this was a guy named Cullen Winsky, who's a rockabilly musician and Elvis collector, at his home. This was a stylist, Rosemary Patronet, and her boyfriend, Steve Huffstetter. This was Belinda Carlisle, who was the lead singer of the Go-Go's at the time, and she and some of her girlfriends rented a house in Central Hollywood, which was nicknamed Disgraceland Manor. As we have Mark Motherspaugh of Devo, which he was very prepared for my arrival. His bandmate Jerry Casal, who was in Brentwood, was equally prepared. John Doe and Exene Cervenka, when they were married, at their house on Genesee Street in West Hollywood. And they used to have a weekly sort of barbecue in their backyard, which was where a lot of the sort of punk rock scene used to gather for Sunday events, which was kind of fun. So at the time, I was trying to work as a photographer, make a living, and transition from being a tour manager to full-time photographer. And my first assignment I got was to photograph Chevy Chase. An art director named Lloyd Ziff asked me to photograph Chevy, and he wanted to look just like a lot of my regular work looked. And he had left Saturday Night Live and was living in a house with all sort of rented furniture. And they said, well, you want to get some of the furniture in. So I go to the house, and I had been on tour pretty much regularly, and I'd never seen Saturday Night Live at that time. I would think it was 1977. So I go to the door, knock on the door, say, this guy comes to the door, say, I'm here to photograph Chevy Chase. He goes, well, he'll be back in a little bit, so you can come in and wait. So we go in and wait, and we're sitting there in the living room and talking. I'm waiting and waiting, and I go, you're him, right? He goes, yeah, that's me. So I started taking pictures, and he was very gracious. You know, we had a nice time. He played some music on his electric piano, and we hung out. My first big assignment was to photograph the Jacksons, and this was Michael at the recording studio where they were making this record, Destiny, which I did the inside cover. We rented a very expensive recording studio. He said, well, we need to shoot in the studio. So they said, well, we'll rent a recording studio. Okay. Phil Collins at the Chateau Marmont Hotel. I remember I was setting up, looking around, and I turned around, and that's what he was doing. I said, that works. So, the light was beautiful. This is Brian Setzer, who was, he had a group called the Stray Cats, as I recall. This was out at Vasquez Rocks, which is a location which is very popular in old Star Trek episodes. But they do a lot of film stuff there. Not so much because it's so recognizable now. This is Aaron Neville of the Neville Brothers. I started working in the studio, and we're seeing some of my Avedon kind of influence coming out. And while I was touring, I used to go to, since I traveled around the country, I would go to all of Richard Avedon's openings all over the country. It was bordering on being an Avedon stalker, I have to say. But I would talk to him and ask him questions and stuff. I remember, I asked him, do you ever shoot 4x5? He goes, why? There's Hasselblad. But he was always very gracious. Henry Rollins at his home in Silver Lake. Another fun assignment I had. Ringling Brothers hired me to photograph Siegfried and Roy at their home with all their animals in the background. And we had to shoot pictures of them holding a white tiger in their living room, which, and they had a manager named Bernie Human who would stand behind me and go, take the picture, shoot the picture now. And I get it because in a couple of seconds, the white tiger would just go amok and start knocking over furniture. But that was like a fun, and they had a publicist who was an old Democratic Party publicist for LBJ. It was very out of context. This guy that met us at the airport, this tall guy in a gray suit, with a Texas accent. It's another shot from the Michael Jackson and the Jacksons shoot, and he was, he was like a light switch. He was very quiet and mellow, and then when it was time to turn on, he just lit up. It was like night and day. This is the picture they ultimately used on the inside cover of the record. This was an album cover that I collaborated with a designer named Mick Haggerty. And I had photographed this band, Gamma 2, which is a band that a guy named Ronnie Montrose had. And Mick said, so you ever shoot with 8x10? And as a freelancer, the answer was yes, even though I'd never laid my hands on one ever. So I rented one for like 2 weeks, and sort of got, read some books on it. This is before online shenanigans. So I basically figured it out, and we shot this, and it's long before digital and Photoshop, so we had to find somebody who let us cut up their lawn. We had these shark's fins made, to hire the model, and the first version of the photo, it was just a woman's legs there. And the record companies had been facing a lot of controversy over violence against women in imagery as a result of a Rolling Stones billboard for an album called Black and Blue, which was really in bad taste and brutal and horrifying. So they said, oh, so we Said, okay, so we hired the model again, put the transparency in the back of the view camera, placed the chaise lounge exactly how it was in the transparency, and then had a guy sit next to her and put his hand there. And then at the printers, they stripped that in. A friend of mine's album, Greg Sutton. This was an album I did for the group The Bangles, and that's 4 different negatives that I had to combine in the darkroom, again before Photoshop, using Ruby Lith, which is very time consuming. I tried to bail on it after the 3rd day of working on it, and I had to get the pep talk from the art director. Chucky Weiss wanted me to do his album, so we did a copy of the photo that I had done earlier, but in an upscale hotel. And that was on the back. In 1978, I was asked to be the photo editor for an upcoming publication called the LA Weekly. So they said, well, you know, we want you to be photo editor. So, you know, we started, this is issue 1. We all moved the furniture in, and it was a really wild year of a lot of crazy people in a newsroom on Sunset, 2 blocks east of Western. Across the street was a bunch of day motels that were frequented by primarily prostitutes. We would look out the window and watch their activities all day long. So we did different covers and different things. So that was my first photo editing sort of experience. And that was fun. Not long after that, I did my first movie poster, which I just shot the figures in Breakin' 2 Electric Boogaloo for Canon Films. Someone here worked there at the time, maybe even worked on this. Then comes the Eastern migration. And I decided to move to New York because I'd been spending a lot of time with Gary Winogrand, and he passed away, and Minnie had passed away a couple of years prior, and I said, I think I'll move to New York. And so I went out to New York and sort of was going back and forth, and this was on one of the trips back and forth where I stopped in Iowa and went to the state fair. But this was in '85 when I first decided to live there. I lived there in the 70s off and on. I had a girlfriend in the West Village in her, you know, $200 2-bedroom apartment on 10th and 6th. So went out to Coney Island, which is where you go when you're not from here to take pictures. And then I met a woman who I would eventually marry, Meg, and we moved to Harlem. And I started photographing every day. One thing I learned from spending time with Gary was to try and photograph every day. So I would photograph in Harlem. I never lived in an inner city community, and that's how I sort of got to know the community and the people. And a lot of times it was sort of learning about the area by looking at the people who live there. And again, I'm using a lot of fine-grained film, flash, and different things. But I did that for a couple of years. And there's right around the corner from my apartment, a picture of a woman smoking Fifth Avenue. That was during the New York Marathon. This is a woman in white. And back then in the 80s, people say, what are you taking the picture for? I'd say, that's what I do. I take pictures of people. And they say, okay. There's no social media, they're not worried about your followers or anything. This picture I call 1254 A. Philip Randolph Square at an anti-crack rally. My wife Meg and her friend Carrie Mae Weems outside our apartment one day where they both had hats and said, take a picture of us. The superintendent of my building at the time, Raleigh. And this was actually a few years ago where I sort of went out to try to relive the 80s, taking pictures of people around. And this is a woman at the African American Day Parade, which is always a great place to make photographs of people because, they're sort of prepared to be photographed. And again, I start to gather groups of pictures and put them in groups and sort of that are similar subjects or themes. It was a series called the Young Men series because I noticed I had a lot of pictures of young African American men. So I compiled them. Young Man, Mount Nebo, Two Friends. This is one of the first times I was using an 8x10 camera outside in New York. It's called New Jacks. These were people that wanted to be extras in the movie New Jack City at Grant's Tomb. A picture called Trans Union Square. A young man and his family, or and his children. This is Chris Rock, who was in New Jack City. I photographed that film as a personal project for several weeks. Young man in plaid in New York. So I grouped that together. And then another series I did was House's Barber Shop, which was, there's a barber shop downstairs from my apartment. And one day the owner saw me, I kept looking in there, and it was really beautiful inside the scene. And I didn't really have the confidence to like try to go in there with my Hasselblad and take pictures. And then one day the owner said, well, I'm about to lose my lease. Can you come in and make photographs? I said, okay. And I photographed in there for 5 or 6 years. And ultimately it became my first book, House, which is available on Amazon, I'm sure. But it was great, moving inside. I remember a photographer named Hilton Braithwaite, he once advised me, you gotta go inside, you gotta go inside. So, anytime anybody asked anything, he'd just say, oh, he's doing pictures for me. And then we showed the work at the Studio Museum, and he was able to renew his lease because of the exhibition. So he was, very appreciative, and I liked that that had happened. Mr. Ben, one of the barbers that worked there. This is a picture called By Black, which is a very layered picture. You have all these icons of black history and culture and the barbers, and then below you have a map, I think is Georgia, maybe. And all these little figures is kind of like, the intellectuals and the masses or something, there's just layers to it. Pattern cut, one of those pictures holding the Hasselblad up over your head. And there's Mr. House, the proprietor, giving somebody a shave. And I think this is the first picture I took in the barber shop, or the first one that came out. That was, on a Saturday. And it was fun shooting there because, you got a lot of things you can do with mirrors. You just have to try to hide yourself when you're taking pictures there. Mr. Ben's hand, I thought this picture really reflected kind of the passing of traditions in the barbershop from old to the young. Again, I'm in New York trying to get some work. So, things picked up a little bit. I remember I spent 3 or 4 days photographing Robert De Niro for a publication, because I'd photograph him for a couple hours. Yeah, you want to come back tomorrow? I said, yep. Kept saying it every day. Naughty by Nature for publication YSB magazine. On the roof of the Puck building, they had a beautiful daylight studio there. Jonathan Demme, while they were shooting Something Wild outside that Mexican restaurant on Broome and 6th Avenue. Philip Glass at his home on the Lower East Side, or the East Village. Pina Bausch at the Paris Opera House, which was a great assignment. BAM sent me all over Europe to do portraits of people coming to the Next Wave Festival, which was a really fun assignment. And this particular space had no light. I remember I had to push the film like so far, it's just like I just left it in the developer forever because just had to shoot wide open at a 30th. Again, sort of working with 8x10, shoot Moni Love. That magazine YSB used to like to shoot 8x10, which was nice because I got to get more experience. Slick Rick in Harlem. TLC in Atlanta, again for YSB magazine. They were fun. I had to do so many shoots in Atlanta, I had a whole production crew there, so I could, go there and just have it ready. Supposed to shoot Jodeci, but only 3 of them showed up, so hence members of Jodeci. Salt and Pepper with Spinderella, and this is, we're still back before digital, even though this is Masters of Digital. And we used to do this thing called cross-processing, where you shoot color negative film and you have them transparent, develop it as transparency, and it changes color and does weird things. But that was a fun way to get a different look. Again, shooting Robert De Niro was on top of the building that he bought, which is now where the Tribeca Film Center is and where the restaurant him and Drew have, the Tribeca Grill. And he said the reason he bought that building, because he always wanted to have a building where he could see the World Trade Center. And this was the first day that I photographed him. There's a guy named Cooter, who's a hunter in Louisiana, and his family. And that was for a book project that they decided was a little bit edgy for their book at the time. But another book. Deborah Willis published it in one of her books. Jazz musician Milt Jackson, out near his home in Teaneck, another cross-processing kind of a thing. And I did probably 4 album covers of him, and he was always great to work with because he would just say, yeah, whatever you do, as long as it doesn't take more than 2 hours. And so he came back over and over again. And he even was a client of House's Barber Shop, so I would bump into him there. Because House's Barber Shop was half a block from a club called Minton's Jazz Club, which was very popular in the 50s and the 60s. And so a lot of the famous jazz guys would go to the barbershop to get groomed before they performed there. Melvin Van Peebles was for a design company. Denzel Washington for American Film Magazine. And he was very gracious and fun. He doesn't like being photographed, so he kept avoiding the photo shoots in New York. And he said, well, I got to go to LA, so we can't do this. I said, oh, I'll be in LA at the same time. Even though I hadn't planned on it, and I remember, my father, who was not happy that I dropped out of college, and I said, well, I'm photographing Denzel in LA, and you're going to be in LA, come to the shoot, impress Dad that I'm making something. So I go, okay, great. So he comes to the shoot, introduces himself, and says to Denzel, I always wanted to ask you something. What's that? You made this movie of Queen and Country. Yeah. He goes, that was a terrible movie. Why did you make it? And there went my contact with the movie star go out the window. And to add insult to injury, Denzel told the story on Jay Leno a few years later. Didn't mention me by name, but I was just watching him and I just fell out. Milt Jackson for another album cover, and that was again on top of the Puck building. This is Redhead Kingpin in Tribeca, just off Canal Street, on Lake Street. Alfred Woodard and Zelda Harris. I was hired to do the poster for the movie Crooklyn, and this was on set. Arrested Development, I did their first 2 records. Oops, we skipped them. They disappeared. All right. Martin Scorsese and Spike Lee when he was making Clockers. Okay. Roxanne Shante. Tretch. That was from that same shoot. Biz Marquis and Cool V. And this is a jazz artist, James Moody. I remember we were setting up the lights and he was sitting there and he said, people know me by my colorful socks. And I remember, I just said, that looks good, let's do that. I got to photograph Bobby Seale in 1994, yeah. And I did a campaign for Ben & Jerry's called Smooth Activists that I collaborated with Spike Lee on. He did the film version, I did the stills. And at our meetings, I said, well, if you're going to have activists, you need to have Bobby Seale. So couple of rappers named Tamrock and EQ in the air shaft of my building. Tracy Chapman in New York. Benny Green for an album Live at the Village Vanguard, which they actually use this on the cover, which is rare when they use a cover where you can't see the person, but that worked out well. Guillermo Gomez Pena, an artist that was part of that Next Wave Festival series of pictures. Method Man for YSB magazine. This was the cover for Arrested Development. And that other picture I think was on their publicity picture. And that was in Georgia. I did their first 2 records. Bobby Brown's first album, The King of Stage. And that was shot over on 14th and 5th Avenue at a studio. I did several OJ's records. They always came back as a client. They were lots of fun. Here's another one. This was another one that was shot on 8x10 and cross-processed, which was kind of a waste to cross-process 8x10 film because it just has so much latitude. This is Redhead. That's the package they did with that, one of the packages. This is another one of the singles, I believe. I mean, at these record cover shoots, you'd shoot like 100 rolls of film and 5 different outfits. This is Tayshaun standing on the wall on Riverside Drive, and it's about a 300-foot drop behind him. It was terrifying. He said, "I'll just get up on here." Ultramagnetic MCs. A group called EU, who had their hit called Debut. It was in the movie School Days. And this was a solution to shooting a group of 10 people, which is difficult, and I found a studio that had a catwalk. So they all occupied the same space in the frame. I was a record cover for The Jazz. Evelyn Champagne King. And my friend Lorna Simpson loaned me a bunch of her furniture and pieces from her collection to sort of style the piece, which was really very helpful. Tracy Chapman for the One from the Heart, the poster they did. This was the poster for the movie Crooklyn, shot on that same stoop, and it's the rare movie poster that's one piece of film. They did a bunch of Photoshop. I don't know if it was Photoshop because this was in the early days, but they added all the color because it was a regular color transparency. So that came out fine. This was another poster that I did for Major Payne, and every figure is a different photo. I remember I only had, 20 minutes with Damon to shoot this because I shot all the kids, and then he came out for 20 minutes. And I remember telling the art director, "It's 20 minutes, I don't know if that's enough time." And he said, "Yeah, it is, that's why we pay you." That's why we pay you a lot, is actually what he said. This was the Ben & Jerry's campaign that we did for Smooth Activists. And we shot at Industria Studios. That we rented 2 studios where they do the film version and then they come over and do the stills. This was the cover that we did with De Niro. This was a cover of Spike out at Yankee Stadium. This was the Denzel cover, shot in LA at a friend of mine's studio on 6th in Normandy, or near Normandy. I used to shoot a lot for Black Enterprise magazine. And they were a great client, very supportive. This is Reginald Lewis, I think, the first black billionaire. And then in '98, the Times asked me if I wanted to be a photography editor there, and I started in the style department. Eventually got to the opinion section when they asked me to curate a column called Exposures. So these are a few of the columns that I was very fond of. That was Rahmet Hammond, Naima Green, a photographer named Russell Monk, and was sort of visual op-eds. And I did that for probably 11 years. Devin Yalkin, this was a year into the pandemic. This was me and a collaborator that I worked with frequently, Rebecca Pietri, photographing Questlove's collection and stuff he has. And I was able to get Questlove to actually write the copy with it, which was nice. And of course, there's Hafu, one of my favorites. And we didn't get to run it in color, but we did get to run it in print. But that was a great series by Sheena Peng, who's sitting over there. And then the year in pictures that I've done for 15 years. And these are a few of the covers, went back a few years. And that's always kind of the high point of my year. We go through like 400,000 pictures in 3 months. And it's exhausting, it's emotionally exhausting, because, you know, it's a lot of bad news in 400,000 news pictures. But we got a great team. Recently, my co-editor became a guy named Tanner Curtis, who's great to work with. We have a good time. And he's the regular editor for Sunday Styles. There's a Max Whitaker wildfire picture. This is a Ukraine cover. This was the Gaza cover by Samira Abu Alouf, who's a Gazan photographer. She lived in Gaza. And this was last year's cover by Doug Mills. And both me and my co-editor went through 20,000 pictures each of Donald Trump to come up with 100 to give the art director to see what she could do with them. And that was really exhausting. And then a discovery of an archive of pictures I'd lost came to light in 2018. And we're going to watch a video for a little bit.
Is the motivation that is hanging up the goddamn nation. Looks like we always end up in a rut. Everybody now trying to make it real compared to what? Come on, baby.
In 2018, my mother passed away peacefully in Berkeley. When our family was preparing to sell the family home, a long-forgotten collection of negative sheets from my childhood was found, photographs I had made as a teenager during the turbulent 1960s in the San Francisco Bay Area. With these aged strips of film my mother had tucked away for half a century, fragmented pieces of my memory have been returned to me like broken artifacts that now can be mended back together for display. At our family home, with its spectacular view of the San Francisco Bay in Berkeley's Claremont area, my parents, who were politically active at the time, hosted a grand party in 1967 to inaugurate and celebrate the transition in the SNCC leadership from Stokely Carmichael to H. Rap Brown. In addition to Stokely and Rap Brown, many of the local political elite were there, including Eldridge Cleaver and other members of the Black Panther Party. I have never forgotten that night. I was a middle school kid in Berkeley, but drawn to the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood of San Francisco where we had previously lived. One June evening, when I was just 12 years old, my parents caught me trying to climb out the fourth-floor window of our home and go see Jimi Hendrix at the Fillmore Auditorium in San Francisco. It was then, they decided, it was time for me to stay with my father's sister in Minneapolis and travel to meet my cousins in Iowa City, Davenport, Detroit, and Chicago. But the summer in the Midwest wasn't some bucolic escape from the Bay Area to visit family. On the contrary, it was to become known as the long hot summer of 1967. 159 violent uprisings broke out in black communities across the country. It was here, for the first time, I saw the brutal face of the violent repression, deprivation, and devastation in poor communities of color. One of our planned destinations was Detroit, where one of the most severe rebellions was taking place at the time. There, 43 people died and hundreds were injured. So we had to detour back into Illinois. In Chicago, I imagined meeting the likes of Muddy Waters or B.B. King as they would just be sitting around on their stoops hanging out like the bands I'd gotten to know on Asbury Street in San Francisco. And it was here, in Chicago, that my grandmother gave me a Kodak Instamatic camera for me to pursue my photography hobby. On this humble Instamatic, I created my first social documentary photos, and one of those rolls was part of the collection my mother had filed away. For the first time since 1967, I was seeing these and other negatives again. Old, dusty, and scratched, these are the only record I have of that summer. They were the first time I had made photographs in an inner city. Some of these frames reveal the time as viewed by a 13-year-old kid from Berkeley seeing the streets of Chicago for the first time that compelled me to shift my adolescent perspective. Returning to Berkeley after the Midwest summer, I was profoundly changed. I felt compelled to document these urban realities and the activists who were trying to change it, to do my part to try and change the world. By the summer of 1968, protests for civil rights, opposition to the Vietnam War, and the military draft were flourishing. My brother Michael, 4 years older, was draft eligible, so he relocated to Canada. I was just entering the 9th grade and not quite 14 years old when I began photographing the Oakland chapter of the Black Panther Party. It was a most revelatory experience. The excitement of the Black Panther movement was crystallized in their visuals: blackness, black berets, and black leather. The leadership of the Black Panthers took me under their wing and directly mentored me. I would visit Huey Newton in jail once or twice a week at the Alameda County Courthouse while he was on trial for the killing of an Oakland police officer during a traffic stop. We talked through a small viewing window framed by walls of thick steel on one of those old-style telephone receivers. Despite having been shot and being on trial for his life, he was always attentive, affable, and full of quick wit. Black Panther Party Chairman Bobby Seale encouraged me to be one of the photographers for the newspaper, the Black Panther paper. Emory Douglas, the graphic artist who art directed all the Panthers' imagery as well as their newspaper, the Black Panther paper, was the first to ever publish my work. It was a graffiti-style painting I had made of little Bobby Hutton that Emory put on the cover of the paper following his murder. He even invited me to work on the newspaper at the home of its editor, Eldridge Cleaver, who, along with his wife Kathleen, lived in San Francisco. I first met Cleaver one day when I was hanging out at the Panther office in Oakland, and he'd stopped by. Bobby Seale came over and introduced us. He said, "Eldridge, this is Jeffrey Scales. He's going to be taking photos for the paper." Eldridge looked at me and asked, "Is Emmett Scales your father?" "Yeah," I said. "Do you still live in that big house in the Berkeley Hills?" Yeah." "Tell your dad y'all need to have a book party for my new book up there." I said, "Well, okay, I'll ask him." And a few weeks later, we had that party. Some of the photographs I took during that time haunt me more than others. Memories, of course, of those who were killed back in those days, others who are still imprisoned after decades, or others who, passed on just as life would have it, and including some memories I have of the disappointing journeys that some of my then idols made in their later years. But a few of these images evoke even stronger ghosts. It was Thursday, April 4th. Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis. The following Saturday in Oakland, 17-year-old Panther Bobby Hutton was killed by the Oakland police following a shootout. While surrendering with his hands raised, clad only in his underwear, emerging along with Eldridge Cleaver from a house in West Oakland which had been firebombed by police munitions, little Bobby, just a few years older than me, died in a hail of bullets. The morning after, the Panther leadership called me to come down and make some photographs. Charred debris from the basement where Eldridge and little Bobby had holed up had been dragged into the street. The smell of burnt wood and the acrid stench of tear gas and gunfire still filled the rooms inside. It was like some kind of eerie open house tour, except the walls were riddled with hundreds of bullet holes, shattered glass, and the suffocating ghost of the previous night's death stealing the air from each room. Seeing those devastated rooms in the few photographs after so many years disturbs me more than I would have imagined. They bring back the feelings I had that day, as an idealistic teenager again being confronted with another harsh reality of governmental violence directed at black activists just days after the murder of Dr. King. In 1969 and for some years following, I made photographs during the riots in Berkeley over an empty lot turned park known as People's Park. That first day in May, the police used live shotgun rounds on the protesters and bystanders, killing one, blinding another, and injuring dozens on what became known as Bloody Thursday. It was also the first and fortunately the only time I've experienced being shot at. In this case, it was by the police, which happened twice during those riots. At the time, I was with some protesters on the balcony of one of the buildings on the UC campus when two officers, one with a standard 12-gauge pump-action shotgun and the other with a tear gas canister launching shotgun, approached on the street below us. The officer with the shotgun looks up at us and shoulders his weapon to fire. I knew it was time to take cover. In what memory seems like slow motion, the shot rang out at us, buckshot splattering on the pillars we had hidden behind, followed by his partner firing a tear gas grenade into the balcony where we stood. The second time I was shot at, I literally dodged a bullet. This time, I was on the street level when a group of police rounded the corner chasing and beating all the demonstrators in their path with nightsticks, when one with a shotgun came after me. I noticed a narrow alley off the block. There, with the shotgun-toting officer in hot pursuit around 25 feet behind me, into the alley I fled, running faster than I ever had and certainly ever since. I saw before me, though, what looked like a 12-foot concrete wall dead-ending my escape route. I suspect the wall was far shorter than that, but at the time, it presented what felt like a potentially deadly obstacle. I quite literally took a leap of faith and propelled myself as forcefully and as quickly as I could to the top of the wall. And as I dropped over the other side, I heard a shotgun blast ring out, echoing off the alley walls like deadly thunder just a few meters behind me. I didn't look back, but proceeded as fast as I could as far as my legs and the air in my lungs would take me before looking back and saying I'd safely escaped. With the arrival of 2,700 National Guard troops overnight, Berkeley then became an occupied city. This past, that for decades remained out of reach except when drawn by my own personal mythology, has now come back to confront me as a man more than 50 years later in this new century in America. Because of chance circumstance during a sharply focused arc of American history that seemed to unfold around me when I was merely a child, much of this past not only belongs to my memory, but is one that has been fixed into our collective American psyche. Yet these memories of struggle have been returned to me at a time when there are powerful forces trying to push the clock back to a time before the years these photographs were even made. It's a desperate effort to reverse the progress America has made since that sharp arc of history helped form our contemporary and somewhat more inclusive America.
Trying to make it real compared to what
So in keeping with photographing groups of people, in 2019 I decided to come up with an 8x10 project and started a project I called Dominant, which was to photograph members of the New York BDSM community. And with the help of Charlotte Taylor, who had a lot of the connections, I started photographing with 8x10 primarily, and in many ways, to me, it was kind of like music has always been something I've been involved with, and this I describe as kind of a Richard Avedon recital. It's 8x10, white background, it's not like he owns it. It's like, a great song that someone else records. And so we shot, the black and whites are all 8x10, and the colors were digital, because sometimes the 8x10s didn't work out. But it was a very powerful experience meeting and getting to know some of these people and what they do in terms of their practice and what it brings to people. But that was a fun project. We shot it in 2019, and we shot in 2020 on the last days before the pandemic shut down. Literally Thursday and Friday before New York closed in March. But I like working with a big camera. It's expensive, but it's the rendering power of the 8x10 is really quite amazing. But that was a project that I was very pleased with. Hopefully we'll do some more on that in the coming times, but the pandemic really changed a lot, particularly if you're a portraitist and you're not getting together with people. So recently I have started a project on Seneca Village, which is a shift, sort of landscape photography, because I wanted to shoot something local that was accessible, and I've been photographing. In 2009, I had started photographing in Central Park, and there were parts near Seneca Village that I had photographed, and I'd always been interested in photographs there. And then I didn't do much of it since 2009. So last year, I said, well, let me go back and continue this project, or be more specific. And Seneca Village was a black community that was taken over and destroyed by eminent domain when they decided to build Central Park. And there were other reasons. It's a long, elaborate story of, displacing this community. And the work, to me, I prefer to photograph in the winter. And, I have my own personal conflicts of the loss of a community and my appreciation of Central Park. So it's, it's internal back and forth. But I've been shooting it on film, and these are pictures from 2024 and 2025. But that's what I'm working on currently for the rest of this year, at least. And I'm looking forward to getting into the darkroom and making some lovely gelatin silver prints, which I miss working in the darkroom. Darkrooms are hard to come by these days. But it's, I get to walk to the park, spend time outside. So that's what I'm doing nowadays. And these are the first sort of scans from, when you get your film processed and you get, sort of quick scans. But it's an interesting story. The New York Historical Society has done a lot of research and presentations on Seneca Village. And there you have it. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you.
Hi, first off, amazing photographs and amazing presentation. I really wanted to ask a little bit more about your journey of also being an educator and working with younger generations, and how you feel this shift of film and digital and AI, and just how some of your perspectives and what you've also have learned as you're dealing with a younger generation, looking back at certain works, especially it's 50 years of differences of what's going on then and now.
There's a lot of layers there.
A lot of layers. You can answer what you want. Dialogue, yeah.
Teaching and mentoring young people is just plain fun and inspiring, and they challenge you, question you, and support you. It's much harder in certain ways for young people to photograph. It's much harder to photograph on the street to a certain extent. You know, people are a little more off-putting because of social media, because they don't know if you have 10 million followers and you're a prankster. But at the same time, because of the digital technology, people can work more. It's more affordable to really, if you want to make a lot of photographs. And, you know, a lot of people like shooting film, and I encourage that, which is nice. There's a certain magic to film which is really special. But, you know, it's a tough business. I teach photojournalism specifically, and it's a tough business. And I remember I once went to a master class by an opera singer, Leontine Price, and she said, look, if you're going to do this, you really have to love the sound of your own voice. And with photography, there's times where, you know, you're not getting any work, you're not making any money, and you're not getting appreciated. But if you got to keep muddling through. I remember when I was in LA as a young photographer, I once couldn't get any appointments, so I showed my portfolio to the mailman. Because I put together this great portfolio and I couldn't get anybody to see it. And he said, oh, that's nice. So, you know, teaching young people is great. It's a hard market nowadays, but if you really love it, and I tell everybody, if you're going to do it, you should shoot every day, even if you're not trying to be a street photographer. But it's like a musical instrument. It's like practice, getting to know the craft, getting used to what things happen in light and different things. You know, and with digital, it's a lot easier because you don't have to get your film process, but you can go edit and make little Xerox prints and like look at stuff. Hope that answers the question.
Beautiful presentation. Thank you. I don't think this thing's.
I don't think that's on.
For the recording, we need to project.
Okay.
We need it for the recording.
Oh, sorry, ma'am. So what did you find? I mean, you had assignments over the years, but what has been like one of your more difficult subjects that you've taken on, or most challenging? You seem like a very calm, you're very calm. And you've worked for, you say, the New York Times. I'm wondering about publishing too. You've worked for the New York Times and the Panther publication, and what other, like editing wise, like who were your mentors in editing?
Oh, in editing?
Yeah, as an editor, I'm curious.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, editing, you just kind of do it. You have trust in your own vision. I worked with an editor at the Times named Barbara Graustark, who wasn't a photo editor. She was a word editor. And the photo department considered her problematic because she was very critical and very hard on getting the photographs. It was a shelter section, it was called House and Home. It was interior design photography. And she always wanted to use high-end interior design photographers because they photograph interiors in a very special way that's different. And they had a lot of pictures and used a lot of really great photographers, because when the Times asked me to come on board, they said, well, is there a section you'd like to do? And I spent a week with the paper, and this one had the most pictures and was all color. I said that, and they said, really? Okay. But she was great. She had a great eye. She secured a budget for me and her to do photography of $250,000 a year, which at that time was extremely high. And there's not much close to that nowadays for like a feature section. And we got to pick whoever we wanted and do whatever we wanted. And so that was a great experience. And she had a great eye. And then management changed, and I realized they were going to take that money away. So then I moved on to another section because, you know, being a fair weather friend, I had to The money was gone, I was gone. And I'd done it for 5 years. I sort of had committed for 5 years. Mentors in my photography, Gary Winogrand was a big mentor. We spent a lot of time in LA photographing. I spent a little time with George Hurrell in Los Angeles. Stephen Shames was a mentor when I was doing the Panthers. And he's got a new retrospective book coming out that he asked me to write the introduction to. So that's about that.
Thank you.
Thanks for your talk.
Thanks for coming.
Question is, photography can be very hit or miss in your years of being a photographer. Had you ever had to have a side job or couch surf with people?
Or as
Friends?
we call it, survival jobs.
That's it.
Yeah, I've got one now. For about 5 years, I had a high-end fine art black and white printing lab I owned and operated because I grew up and had a darkroom my entire life, and I could honestly say I, at the time, was a master printer of gelatin silver prints. So we would print for a lot of high-end clients. One client, a guy named Norman Seif, who did a lot of music stuff, and he always delivered his jobs on 16 by 20 Portraiture rapid paper, ferrotyped. So we had to get a ferrotyping dryer, and he always, would deliver like 20 to 40 prints. And he was very precise about what he wanted. And there was other clients that we worked for. So that was a side job. Yeah, I've done some side jobs. I remember I took the taxi test in LA because I wasn't making any money, and right before I was supposed to start driving a cab is when I got the Jackson 5 album cover. So I was saved from that. And doing road work. When I went to work for Cher in 1980, that was a side job because I'd gotten robbed twice in LA, and I figured I was cursed in LA, so I had to leave town, so I called it. Said, I need to get a job out of town. And they said, well, go on the road with Cher.
Not bad.
Thank you for sharing your work with us. I'm wondering about how you think about audience and impact in your personal work. From the earliest archival images that you rediscovered, I think 2018, to your most recent work with Seneca Village, there's a clear timeliness and political social commentary thread that's woven through all of these decades. And so I'm wondering, in your mind's eye, who is the work for, even beyond this moment, and what is the ultimate impact you want that work to have?
Well, that's a big question. It works for everybody. It works for people to take something away from. With the work like the Panther work, it's an important historical document. And one of the things with the older work, that when that Panther work was discovered, and we were preparing the book and making the exhibitions, it really hammered into me the importance of still photography and history, because still photography is one of the best mediums for describing historical events, because it has an aesthetic, it's like kind of permanent, and people can take away slightly different interpretations, but it really locks in moments of history. And so after that work came out, that's when I really dove into my very unorganized 25 file boxes of film to try to get everything scanned and cataloged in some regard. But I think it's important to document the times you're in for historical purposes, because then people can, look back like with my Panther work, 50 years later, and there is someone's vision of that event. But the work is for anybody, you know, and you know, I have a little bit of a progressive agenda, I would imagine, just from growing up in Berkeley and parents who are activists and being in these difficult times we're in that weren't solved before January, and now, you know, we're decades before January. So, you know, the work is for anybody. And Seneca Village interests me, as I said, it's a project that's accessible to me, and it's a very interesting and powerful story when you actually dig into the history of it. And it's a place where some powerful and interesting images I can make. And one of the things I remember when Gary was mentoring me, and I was a broke photographer in LA, and you know, we were having coffee one day, and he was talking about living in LA. He says, the one thing I noticed in LA is photographers are always waiting for an assignment, always waiting for someone to tell them what to take a picture of. And they never do enough work to realize their own potential. And that transformed my practice. And that's when I started photographing every day. I used to go out in LA and photograph every day. And there's not a lot of people on the street in LA, but it was, you know, people say, so what are you taking pictures of? I said, nothing, just pictures. But again, it develops your eye. It's like if you're a guitar player, you practice every day. Piano player, you practice, you know, and it's just learning your instrument, being comfortable and learning new things and ways to tell stories with your instrument and to make poetry with your instrument.
Okay, happy with that. Yes.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm actually really curious about your Seneca Village series. And as a photographer myself, I think of like a decisive moment that one waits for or one tries to capture. And can you talk more about how you capture something that no longer exists?
Well, that's, you don't capture something that no longer exists. I'm making photographs of what does exist. What no longer exists is in my mind and in history, and trying to evoke just my personal relationship with that space, and hoping that something is evocative of how being in that space makes me feel. That's why I sort of call it a meditation on Seneca Village. And I've just started doing this work, so, you know, it's fairly early in the process of what I'm doing. And it's also, you know, much has been sort of talked about recently of photographers of color and their access to the American landscape hasn't been encouraged by the industry or the, you know, the ivory towers or whatever. But, you know, that's also something that is interesting to me, that I hadn't done. I mean, I've been a portraitist most of my life, so it's, you know, it's a little bit different, but it's still documentary.
Kind of follow-up. I love the idea of a meditation and your feeling about the space. I've seen historical photographs of Seneca Village, and it was kind of concentrated in one area. Have you researched and kind of like gone to that particular area where it was?
Oh, that's the only area I'm photographing.
Oh, it is. Okay, that's what I was curious about.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, that's.
Great. Anyone else? Ooh.
Thank you. I think I had my socks knocked off. Great presentation.
Oh, thank you.
You were speaking to a film that you liked to use back in the day when you were shooting 2 1/4, and then you went to 4x5. I'm curious because, see, I lived in a darkroom for many years also, but was there a developer film combination that you particularly wanted to use because you pre-visualize your shots when you set them up. You want them to come out with that particular grain pattern, and the light. It's got to interact with the lighting. Was there a developer that you enjoyed?
I used to use Panatomic X film and used Accu1 developer, which was the one-shot AccuFine. And one of the reasons I like to use that is because it expires during the development process. It won't just keep over-developing. It was like 6 minutes, 7 minutes, and then it was done.
But what did it do for your grain?
Well, Panatomic X had very little grain.
But the developer.
I liked how it looked. You know, it had a nice quality. But like I say, Panatomic X tended to go contrasty. And the fact that this developer would stop developing was something I liked. I also used to use a film called Verichrome Pan, but I didn't process any of that myself. I started using that when I came here. But you know, those films are gone. And you know, Tri-X is a great film, particularly in medium format. So you know, it gets the job done as well. I remember I was once hired to teach a photography class at ICP, which didn't go well because my development technique was, it was a darkroom class, and my development technique was a little loose. I remember teaching the class, and when you've been doing it your whole life, there's certain things that are automatic. I remember saying, well, you get your developer, I stick my finger in and it says, yeah, you want it to feel about like that. That's the right temperature. And then you develop it. You go, well, 5, 6 minutes. Yeah. That was my maiden voyage teaching that was somewhat unsuccessful.
Hi, Jeffrey. I just want to congratulate you. Very powerful.
Well, thank you.
I mean, it's really like, unbelievable. But I want to, so many questions I want to ask you over coffee. You know, boy, that section of the Panthers and the, you know, Bobby Seale and Eldridge Cleaver coming to your house, that's unbelievable. I mean, what a incredible. But I just want to ask you about your parents and your grandparents. You know, you mentioned your parents were activists. Were they in the Panthers? Was your grandparents? I mean, where was can you just talk about your DNA?
My parents are from Des Moines, Iowa. My mother was white, daughter of a car mechanic. My father, black, son of a doctor. And they came out west because it was illegal for them to be married in Iowa at the time. My father was involved in the music business, owned a high-end hi-fi shop, and managed people like the Kingston Trio and some other people. And he was involved in activist activities. He was not a member of anything. My mother was more in the sort of San Francisco beatnik, you know, communist kind of community. She was an artist. She was a painter. So when we moved to Berkeley, you know, we had this house with a ballroom that we would have these events and fundraisers, and my father was involved in poverty programs and political activism to a little bit degree. So, you know, those people were around, you know, and I was just influenced by it. And you know, they groomed me to be a photographer, even though my father was conflicted because he wanted me to have a nice corporate job. But at the same time, he gave me a Leica when I was 11. He gave me 30 years of Life magazines, 20 years of Look magazines. And, you know, my mother was a painter. She had a big painting studio at the house. And she would take me to her graduate art classes when I was very, very young because, you know, it was easier than childcare. So, you know, I was going to the San Francisco Art Institute when I was 10. But, so that's kind of the DNA. My grandparents On my mother's side, very nice people, you know. They didn't have a lot of contact with the extended family, particularly on my mother's side, because her siblings didn't approve of her marriage and whatnot. So there was a certain, I won't say a wall, but it was, you know, her parents were fine and nice and, you know, came to visit a lot, but the other relatives, we really didn't get to know too much till later in life when everybody decided everything was just fine. There was a question with the scarf. Didn't you have a question?
Oh yeah, I did. I forgot it. Somewhere in my brain. Oh yeah. Well, hold on. All right. I have one. So you've been working at the New York Times. I was wondering is there a memorable moment while choosing photos, while putting these features together, something that comes to mind that you can share with us that sort of stands out?
A memorable, 9/11 was a memorable moment. I remember one of our photographers that was at ground zero disappeared for several hours, and we were in a panic. Ruth Fremson, it was like a couple hours before she showed up. But working closely with the staff photographers was pretty memorable. People like Tyler Hicks and Doug Mills. It's an exciting place to work, and there's a lot of really great people to be around there, and a wealth of knowledge. You know, it's a corporation, it's a job, so it has all that fun stuff. But there's a lot of great people there. I'd love doing that column exposures that I was able to do for about 11 years, and bringing different voices into the paper and giving people a platform for their personal vision of different things. So those were always exciting.
Thanks for sharing.
Great. All right, we're pretty much out of time, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.